typically in fear. Just a couple of examples of this. Some of us in here probably remember the fears that led into Y2K, right? The computers were going to reset and bring society to its knees. One story that I read was that some individuals, they were so worried that they started hoarding supplies, the typical toilet paper, bottled water, a chemical toilet, whatever that is. But again, how does that story end? Well, according to this individual, the food pantries and the Goodwill stores were well stocked after that, right? Even just a couple of years ago, with the start of the pandemic, we saw how people reacted in the face of a fearful time. Some of us, we probably had to, if we were truthful, some of us, we probably had to ship toilet paper out from somewhere else, right? And even what's going on right now in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of fear and worry about what could happen. Inflation's already high. Is it going to get higher? Gas prices are high. Are they going to get higher? Is it going to lead to war and the draft and things like that? Those are things that are going through people's minds right now. But what we'll see today is how the people of God respond in the face of a fearful time. It's this disturbing vision that Daniel has here in chapter 8. Like I said, he's physically sick upon seeing it. But in the face of a hard time for God's people, in the face of war, in the face of a pandemic, even in the face of our own darkness that we have to deal with throughout the week, it's because of who God is, we are able to live in a way that's counter to the rest of the world. So we're going to be in Daniel chapter 8. I'll pray, and then we'll look at the first few verses. Father, I just pray for this time in your word. I pray that you open our hearts and minds to it. I pray that we remember that what you've done for us during this time. You died for us, you saved us, and you brought us into your kingdom where you're a good king. You rule, and you have a plan for all time, and you're working that plan out now as you have over the last few thousands of years. Have us remember that, and as we look into your word, let us respond to it in faith. And I pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. So let's go ahead and read the first couple of verses. Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw it, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. So, just a little bit of context. So Daniel is receiving this vision in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. So if you remember chapter 7, that was in the 1st year of this Babylonian king. Not only that, but Daniel specifically says at the end of verse 1, this vision happened after that which appeared to me at the first. So this vision that we're about to look at is not supposed to be seen in isolation, okay? We're supposed to keep in mind what happened in chapter 7 and to connect these two, what God is trying to say. And if you weren't here, in chapter 7, if you remember, there were these 4 beasts which signified the different kingdoms. So you have Babylon, you have Persia, you have Greece, and then Rome. And there's going to be a little horn with a lot of persecution going to happen for the people of God. But the point of that vision and the point of that chapter was that even though there's these great kingdoms, God has a greater kingdom, and he's ruling over all of them. And not only that, his kingdom will overcome all kingdoms at the end, and he will rule completely on this earth. Okay? So we need to keep that vision in mind because it's going to be important for what we're going to be looking at today. And so then Daniel has this vision. Let's read 3 through 14. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. He had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So there's a lot of weird things going on here. There's goats, there's rams, there's horns, and there's horns coming out of horns. Luckily for us, a lot of the things in here are already interpreted for us. So if you look ahead a little bit, we're going to read it later, but in verses 20 and 21, we understand who the ram and the goat are. So in verse 20 it says, As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So just as last week, we're talking about the Persian Mede Empire, we're seeing that again today. So there's the ram. It has 2 horns, and one being bigger than the other. If you remember last week, we talked about how the Persian side of that empire was the greater of the 2. And so right after the Babylonian Empire, there will be this Mede-Persian Empire taking its place. But it's not the only one, right? Verse 21 tells us what the goat is. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So this goat is Greece. Right after Persia, the next big empire is Alexander the Great coming and taking over the known world. And we can assume very clearly that this is talking, the great horn is talking about Alexander the Great. If you remember Alexander the Great, he conquered very quickly. In fact, he was very young comparatively too. He was like 32 years old when he had conquered the world. And in verse 5, it says that the male goat came without touching the ground. So it was so quick, he took the land so quick, it was as if he wasn't even walking. But then that great horn, as we just read, was broken, and 4 came up. And as we know, the empire after Alexander the Great died was divided among his 4 generals. This isn't any new information. We actually talked about this last week, right? But there is a new character on the scene with the little horn. If you remember, from one of those 4 horns, there's this little horn that comes out. Now, Last week, we talked about the little horn, and it could mean multiple things. It could mean an emperor from Rome. It could mean eschatologically the Antichrist or the man of lawlessness, or however you want to phrase it. Or it could just symbolize evil in the world. This little horn is a different little horn. It's symbolizing something different. So keep that in mind for chapter 7, but this is a different little horn. And really, it's universally understood who this little horn is. Because as we read, this is a very evil person and creates a lot of persecution for the people of God. And in the 2nd century BC, there is this individual named Antiochus. And I probably said it wrong. I'm not Greek. But, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later, but some things to point out about him. He equates himself with God, verses 10 and 11. He affects the offering of the people of God, verse 12. And as we'll see, he'll even challenge God himself. This is a nasty guy. And again, there's very little debate that is who this little horn is. Even historically, not in the, I have to be careful how I phrase this. So in the book of Maccabees, which is a historical book, not an authoritative book that some people have, it even points to the same individual, okay? So what we're seeing here is that the future is on display to Daniel, okay? All of these things that's being talked about right now actually happen. Right after Rome, there's Persia. Right after Persia, there's Greece. And Antiochus, he does come and he does hurt the people of God. And really, Daniel at this point, he has about 12 more years in the Babylonian kingdom before there's a switch of kingdoms, right? And so the future is on display right now. God's not, he's not just sitting on his throne being like, man, the Persians came? Like, oh no, what's going to happen after Rome? God knows what's going to happen. And really, chapter 8, when you get to critical scholars, they have a lot of issues with chapter 8. From our understanding, this was written probably in the 6th century BC, foretelling what is going to happen. But a lot of critical scholars think that maybe it was written around the 2nd century BC. And the reason for that is twofold. Mostly critical scholars are not Christians or believers, and so because of that, they don't believe in the miraculous or the supernatural, right? But there's no proof that this was written in the 2nd century BC. In fact, Daniel, when we read those first 6 chapters, there's too much details that Daniel has for it to be written later on in history. And so we're able to look at chapter 7, chapter 8, and the rest of Daniel as God not only ruling over everything, because remember, that's what we talked about last week. God rules over everything, but that also God knows the future and he knows what everything is going to happen. Again, nothing catches God by surprise. The rise, the fall of kingdoms, God knew that was going to happen. God knew there would be a pandemic in 2020. God knew what's going on in Eastern Europe right now. He knew that was going to happen. That is who you serve, and that is who you are betting your life on right now. The God that rules and the God that knows the future. And even think about it for a second on your own personal level. Because I know a lot of us, we struggle throughout the week. There's a lot of sin, there's a lot of temptation that we struggle with. And some of us, when we fall to temptation, we might think, oh man, I caught God by surprise with my sin this week. But he knew you before you were born. He chose you. He died for you, knowing exactly what you would struggle with. And he paid the penalty on the cross for you anyways. The God who rules knows the future. And that includes the good times, like our salvation. He knows who's going to be saved. But that also includes the hard times for the people of God. So let's read 15 through 26. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddle, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told to me is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So Daniel, he has this vision, and he's not left to just wonder what all this means. He gets an interpretation. And so from 18 through 22, the angel tells Daniel exactly what we already talked about, right? It's about the Mede-Persian Empire all the way through this 4 divisions of the Greek Empire. But in verses 23 through 26, there's this focus on the indignation. There's this individual that will come up. He'll be bold. His power will be great, and he'll cause fearful destruction. Not only will he be deceitful, but he'll be surrounded by deceit. And as bad as that is, he'll rise up against God himself. He'll rise up against the Prince of Princes, as it says. And he'll destroy mighty men. And believe it or not, there will be a large persecution for the people of God. And again, this will happen. And from history, we know that it has happened. Antiochus was a madman during his time. Verse 24, it says that this little horn is a destroyer, not just by the many men, but also the people of God. During his time, he would try to unify his kingdom, his area, over religion. So that meant sacrificing things on altars that were not meant to do. He viewed himself as great. He viewed himself as God in many ways. And as I said, he was extremely deceitful. All of these things were prophesied and happened in history. And we know that there is a specific reason for this, and a specific reason that the people of God, that the Jews at this time experienced this. And we already read it in verse 12. and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. So this is still God disciplining God's people at this time. Right before the Babylonians came and conquered Judah, the people of God were not faithful to God. And so he's bringing other nations to discipline them and things like that. Now, there's good news in our understanding of that. Because imagine that you're a Jew in the 2nd century BC. You know history, you're not in your country anymore. There's been kingdom after kingdom after kingdom taking over your land. And now a madman has taken over, and you may die, you may have to suffer. And the world seems like it's out of control. But as out of control the world may seem, what we're seeing here is that God is still in control. He's still ruling. He knows what will happen, and he's still ruling, even in the darkest of times. You see, the reality is that God rules over all things and knows what will happen in human history, even the darkest moments. Like last week, we saw how it all ends, right? God has a purpose, and he's working towards something in human history. And we saw one part of that in Revelation, but here, again, as crazy as the world is out of control, here's listen to Revelation 21:3-4 about how it all ends. Speaking about the new heaven and new earth. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things passed away." That's what God's working towards. That's what he was working towards in the 2nd century BC. That's what he's working towards in Eastern Europe right now. And that's what he's working towards in your darkest moments. We have a God who rules, who knows the future, and we know what the future looks like. And notice how those truths affected Daniel. Read verse 27. "And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it." So was Daniel scared? Yeah, persecution's scary. Was Daniel appalled? Like the things he saw, those weren't things that produced joy, right? But it says that Daniel rose and went about the king's business. He went about his day. He continued to do what God had placed him at this moment to do, faithfully, to live faithfully. You see, when we really know who God is, when we really know that he's in control and all-knowing, it should lead us as saints, as people of God, to continue the work that God has placed us here to do, regardless of what's going on in the world. Daniel still had a job to do. He has another kingdom. He has another 2 kingdoms that he has to serve under. And as you can see, we have like 3 more chapters left after this, right? He still had work to do. And if you think your job right now as a believer saved by Christ is just to store up, save your life, dependent on what's going on in the world, then there's a chance you don't understand why you were saved. Like we love Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, for by grace you've been saved. But verse 10 says that God has saved you to do good works, which God prepared beforehand. Regardless of what's going on in the world, God has saved you to do some good work in this world. John Wesley, there was a moment where he was asked, if Jesus was to come back today, how would that impact your life? Like, what would you want to do right now? And so he looked at the sky and he picked out his planner and looked at it. It's like, well, I already have what I'm going to do. Go about the rest of my day. There are obviously some wise things to do in the midst of hard times. But we do not shelter away from this world, and we do not seek to last on this earth as best as we can. We do not lose heart because we know who's in control, and we continue to obey God according to his word. See, there's uncertainty in this world all the time. As bad as the pandemic now, or even in the 20th century may be, the Black Plague got rid of most of the population in the world at the time. But Christians at that time trusted the truth that we just talked about today, that God is in control, that he knows the future, and that their eternity is secure. In the world during the Black Plague, get away, get away, get away. But many Christians went and ministered to people that were affected by the Black Plague. World War II, another time of uncertainty. But there were Christians who trusted the realities of God and they trusted the future that God has for them. And some lost their lives even trying to take down Hitler, Bonhoeffer being one of the more famous ones. There's uncertainty today, just as there will always be fearful uncertainty tomorrow. But you have the choice right now as to whether you're going to live by fear the rest of your life, as the rest of the world does, or live by faith in light of who God is and what he's done for you. As this world sits in worry, as we live in a town that historically is very afraid of what's going on in the world, let us as a church be different. Let us live as people that have a God that is over everything and knows everything. Let's live by faith. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you that you're God, that you are who you are. You're all-knowing, you're all-powerful, you're ruling, sitting on your throne, knowing how everything is going to shake out. And I pray that we trust you in this, not even just on a global scale, but even as we go about our week or our day. There's many temptations in the world right now to turn from you and not trust you. And I pray that we see all the ways that you've been right in your word. And I pray that we live by faith accordingly. Lead us and guide us according to your word. And it's in your son's name I pray. Amen.